The coronavirus pandemic has been heavily impacting billions for over 2 years, and its effects on global issues will be felt indefinitely. Throughout the course, we discuss topics such as natural resources, population, technology, communication, government, conflict, and economics. While these provide us with plenty to discuss, this video essay aims to discuss COVID-19's effect on technology, particularly its contribution to the phenomenon known as the digital divide. Before we go any further, let's talk about what the digital divide is exactly. Stanford University defines the digital divide as being, quote, the growing gap between the underprivileged members of society, especially the poor, rural, elderly, and handicapped portion of the population who do not have access to computers or the internet, and the wealthy, middle class, and young Americans living in urban and suburban areas who have access. Essentially, the digital divide is the division between those who can afford, have access to, and or know how to use the internet and those who cannot. Putting this into the context of our shared experiences throughout the pandemic, we start to see how COVID-19 exacerbated this phenomenon. However, it's also important as scientific, well-read individuals that we never simply jump to conclusions based on logic alone. When forming arguments of any kind, it's highly important we apply critical thinking skills. Considering the complicated nature of these topics, it's imperative to properly analyze our data, develop well-thought-out logic and reasoning, examine biases, including our own, as well as contrasting viewpoints, and consider implications. Should we fail to do so, we're doing a disservice to ourselves and others by potentially spreading poorly reasoned arguments and misinformation, as well as proliferating the practice of doing so on its own. So as we continue, we must talk ourselves through the critical thinking process, as we've done many times in this course. First, we formulate our question. What do we want to know? How do we ask it? Especially make sure it's specific enough that we can begin to ideate our solutions, as our question can oftentimes guide how we choose to answer it. In this instance, our question would be, has the rise of remote work and digital communication caused by the COVID-19 pandemic increased the digital divide? Next, it's important to gather and apply our information. When amassing sources, we should be looking for information that is as current as possible, highly relevant, verifiable, written by credible authors, and as objective as possible. Ideally, you'll have around 2 to 4 of them so as to be able to back up your talking points. In this case, I've chosen articles from the Pew Research Center and the University of Washington. From these articles, I was able to gather some thoughts on what I'd read. Mainly one, it makes sense that the COVID-influenced increased use of technology for work, school, and communications would worsen the digital divide. And 2, the growing necessity of the internet in education and work puts those with a lack of knowledge or experience utilizing it in those contexts at a major disadvantage. Then, we must consider the negative implications of our question on our topic. For instance, if the digital divide increases, more of those that can be affected by it are in a compromising position. Lower income families, those without formal educations, etc., etc. Also, if the digital divide is increasing, the way in which the internet is viewed and utilized needs changed. It's basically become an essential for modern existence in some capacity, and much effort is going to need to be put into the proliferation of training and means of access for those unable to afford standard methods of use. This is less of a negative implication for society as a whole, however, as it is for those looking to make the most money from the current business model, i.e. capitalizing on what should be public goods. Exploring these ideas altogether helps us to appreciate the scope and impact of our topic, as well as how we navigate finding solutions and or finalizing our thoughts. Another step we must take is that of exploring other points of view, which is usually the toughest for many and for good reason. It's rather difficult to look at things from the polar opposite perspective sometimes. For this particular subject, that would mean finding sources that do not agree with the notion that the COVID-influenced rise and adoption of telecommuting for work, education, and communication has impacted the digital divide. In this case, despite efforts to find them, there appear to be no sources that negate our question, as it seems to have been the universal experience that this increased digital activity has, therefore, increased the divide. Finally, with all of our research, ideation, and analyses in consideration, we can begin drawing conclusions and answer our original question. In this case, we can come to the conclusion that the rise of remote work, telecommunications, and technology adoption due to the COVID-19 pandemic has increased the digital divide, as studies show how clearly many people have acknowledged the increased usage and importance of digital technologies in their everyday lives and work environments. The move from in-person work environments to remote ones is well documented and was widely adopted in industries that did not require much more beyond computer-based activities. Outside of these contexts, those working in more specialized industries or those that don't require much experience or formal education to work in them had to remain in person for obvious reasons. Those affected the most by the digital divide are those who either do not possess the formal education to work in positions providing remote work, cannot easily afford access to them, whether it be the technology itself or the internet required, and even those in areas where access is hard to come by. In turn, the pandemic-caused shift has exacerbated this issue and brought its severity into widespread notoriety.